So we have to always be careful about using this extenuation, this moral extenuation of, well, you have to understand the times. And that's true of the left. You see, let's be clear about that. That's true of the left. I've known many wonderful human beings who were outright apologists for Stalin. My first mentor, Paul Sweezy, the great Marxist economist, the greatest of his generation.
The monthly review economist?
Yes. Harvard educated, brilliant guy. But he was a complete apologist for Stalin. And I once asked him, well, Paul, how do you feel in light of the history, in light of what's been revealed? And he said to me, Norman, you have to understand the times. You have to understand the times. And in part, there's truth to that, the feeling that there was only two choices between the Nazis and those who were playing the overwhelming role in defeating the Nazis, namely the Red Army. So in part, there's an argument, but also when Joseph Stalin died, Paul Sweezy wrote in Monthly Review, his magazine that he edited. He wrote, quote, "There is no doubt that Joseph Stalin will go down in history as one of the great revolutionaries." And when I read that in the 1970s, my heart sank. I was so disappointed. Which is to say, when he wrote that, and when Stalin died, I guess Stalin died in 1953, it was already very well known what he had done. The war was over, so the argument about you have to understand the times. So one has to be, I think, cautious about using this argument about the times. And I would say Kendi's book doesn't do any of that. I read the book very carefully. All I saw was the promiscuous flinging of labels on people, no analysis, no attempt to do what a historian does.
To comment on some of the things you just said. So first of all, on the question of greatness, I think it's very useful for people to, because like I think in most people's minds, the word good and great could be somehow synonymous, but I think it's probably more useful to view greatness as a totally amoral quality, right? You could have a kind of greatness in something that's just like totally evil, right? And unjustifiable in the kinds of ways that we think about the world. You could have greatness that artistic greatness that breaks in a totally different direction. Specifically in the case of Stalin, I'm always amused by Westerners that have these like very positive views of figures like Stalin. But at the same time, I'm also very aware, right, being from Belarus and my family being from Russia, right, my great grandmother, she absolutely loved Stalin to the day that she died. She was
so did my mother and father.
And specifically with your parents being Holocaust survivors, right? That would be a part of it. My great grandmother, she remembers essentially hiding out, having absolutely nothing to eat. She would tell me things like, I can't believe that I never thought there would be a day when I could see a piece of bread on the table and not want to eat it and eat the whole thing right away. That's how hungry she was during World War II. So in her mind, being, somebody that's essentially a peasant, she had, the pre-war and the post-war experience. The central figure there is going to be Stalin. Guess what? That's going to bring Stalin a whole lot of political legitimacy. A lot of Westerners right now, they're freaking out about figures like Putin. And we could say so many negative things about him, but the fact is, he probably has, in the eyes of Russian people, more political legitimacy than any president that we had in like the last 50 years, because for Russians that, were alive in the 80s and the 90s, they have the experience of the 90s, and then they have the stabilization after the 90s. When Putin ran in his 99 campaign, he said, it's going to be, the phrase was, a dictatorship of the law. That's a very strong contrast from the experience of the 90s. Xi Jinping, if you were around in China in the 80s, right, and this, let's say you were born when I was born, 1987. Now, 1987 to 2023 in America, it's not a huge amount of differences. There's some, but it's not huge. In China, 87 versus 23, we're talking about a middle class that was maybe 10% or 5% back then, to now it's like 60 or 70% of the people. That is not anything that we could really conceptualize. So that's kind of how these things work. Specifically, like people like Lincoln, I agree with your assessment. And I think it is kind of psychologically useful to, on the one hand, acknowledge that, yes, Lincoln, for instance, he was clearly a racist. But on the other hand, isn't there something, to go back to the idea of greatness, isn't there something great about a human being who could simultaneously be racist, but also say, you know what if in some way I think that I might be wrong? What if my racist feelings should be superseded by the idea that we need to get rid of slavery? That's a separate question, right? Yeah.
That's what Dr. West said when we did the interview. You just have to be very impressed by the personal transformation, which seems to have been authentic. I mean, there is a line. I don't have it. Let me see if I could. What's that guy's? Oh, yeah. I'm going to just read one line, if you'll forgive me. One sentence. It's not mine. I'm not promoting my book. I'm promoting Abraham Lincoln, which is something. It's a different order. So on page 303, fortunately, I have a name index, which I created. Abraham Lincoln gives the second inaugural, okay? The speech for the second inaugural, very short. Even the Gettysburg Address is very short. You'd be very surprised. I thought it was a very long document until I started to read Lincoln. So this is what Lincoln says in the second inaugural. Yet, if God wills that the Civil War continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen, the slaves, 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, that is to say, now my paraphrase of his brilliant prose, if the Civil War continues to the point that all the unearned wealth that we acquired through slavery will be squandered because of the war, will be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash, every drop of blood that was drawn with the slave driver's lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. That means for all the blood of African Americans that was spilt by the slave driver, if all that blood was then paid back with all the deaths in the Civil War, and it was 700,000 deaths, he says, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. I would say I'm heading towards 70 years old. That is the single most stirring line I have ever read in my life. Yes. And coming from Abraham Lincoln, if all the money we extracted unfairly from those slaves for 250 years, and all the blood that was spilt by the slaves due to the slave driver's lash, if all of that is lost, because now it's Americans, whites, who are dying in the Civil War, 700,000, not a small number. He said, it's still worth it because it's right to end the slavery. It's the moral sentiment combined with the prose there is an awful lot in that one sentence, you know. And then to reduce the magnitude of what's going on in that one sentence to just hurling a label, racist. Is that history? It's just stupid. It's just stupid.
The last line is reminiscent of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, the final line there. The great shroud of the sea rolled on as it did 5,000 years ago. Just to like dwell just a tiny bit more on Stamped.
That may have been an impact because, you know, Melville was
he might not actually have, because Melville went through a period where his last 20 years of life, everything that he wrote was out of print, including Moby Dick. Nobody really knew him that well until the 1920s.
It was known, I think it was known that he was a public defender of John Brown.
Mm-hmm. So
that aspect of Melville, I don't know. Look, I'm completely speculating, but that aspect may have been known. In any case, there are spectacular moments. Listen, you can say 10,000 things about Martin Luther King, but I think that last speech he gave on April 3rd, 1968, that speech on the eve of his assassination, I think that's the greatest speech ever given in human history. I do. I've talked to many people about that. There's nothing really that compares to it. That last speech, I still tear up, and I must have listened to it 100 times.